All right, I want to welcome you tonight and invite you to turn in your Bibles this evening to Acts chapter 8. And they've got this running a little bit hot tonight so you all can hear. And we're going to go to prayer in just a few moments, but Acts chapter 8. And I want to read the first 4 verses there in Acts chapter 8 and then give you a few pointers for tonight. Somehow we picked March weather in May for prayer meeting here. But I appreciate those of you who've made an effort to be out here, and I trust the Lord will meet with us tonight in a special way. The Bible says, "And Saul was consenting unto his death. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word." And I want you to think especially about verse number 4. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word. There's just a couple of thoughts here from Acts chapter 8 tonight. And we see here in verse number 4 that there would be a problem. Something that any of us would perceive as a problem. The church that was at Jerusalem was, by all standards of human measure, a successful church. They were growing, people were getting saved, there were people getting baptized, there were thousands upon thousands of people who had been converted. God was doing a tremendous work in the city of Jerusalem. And now, after the stoning of Stephen, one of the first men chosen as a deacon of that church, a tremendous persecution came upon this church. This was a praying and preaching church. It was a church that was serving the Lord with fervency and with passion. God was blessing their ministry, but they were attacked by a terrible persecution. And I'm thankful tonight that we have freedom in our country to worship. I'm thankful for the liberties that we still enjoy. I'm thankful that we're not under persecution. And yet for churches tonight, there's still some problems. There's still difficulties that we face. Certainly the situation that we're up against right now is a problem. The virus, which has caused it to be very difficult for us to gather together. And even in this fashion tonight, and yet we're missing many of our church members, and we long for the day when we can be back together as a church family. There's all kinds of difficulties that could come upon a church, but what I want you to understand is that problems encountered by a church, that's not a new thing. Since the first church that was established, churches have faced problems and difficulties. There have been issues that churches have had to deal with, and in this case, it was a persecution. And as a result of that problem, the Bible tells us here in verse number 4 that they were scattered. And that word scattered is very interesting. It's actually a farming word that speaks about, it's a picture word that's the same as when a farmer goes out and he sows the seed on the field. And he would cast that seed out and it would fall upon the ground. And the idea here in verse number 4 is that because of the problem, the church at Jerusalem was sowed out into the surrounding areas. They had to flee for their lives. They had to go to other locations. And we know one place that they went, which is found here in Acts chapter 8, is to a city of Samaria. And some of them went to a city called Antioch. And all other places all around, fleeing from the persecution. So because of the problem, there was a scattering that took place. Now I want to say this tonight, that as a church, I said on Sunday night, the very definition of a church is an assembly. We can't be a church without assembling. And yet there is a precedent, and we see in the history of the Lord's churches that though it is important to assemble, there are times when God allows situations that result in scattering. Sometimes, sometimes this is and intentional scattering, such as when we send one of our families to a foreign mission field and we scatter them to a different part of the world where we long to see a church established. And that's a kind of scattering. It's not that they've left our church, it's not that they're no longer a part of our church, but it is that in order to fulfill our mission, we're going to need to have some folks go. There'll be some scattering that takes place. Sometimes I think that we could even say the situation that we're facing right now is involving some scattering. We've not been able to assemble in the way that we've been accustomed to, and we've been separated from one another. Though we've tried to implement some tools and some methods of staying in touch, we find that it still is difficult, and situations or problems can come up that result in a scattering. But now look there in verse 4 at the result of this scattering, because it says, "Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word." And so something that I was intrigued by is that it doesn't seem like the church at Jerusalem was so disturbed by the problem and by the scattering that they spent all of their time complaining and trying to figure out how to get back together. But rather, they realized that there was a divine purpose, and they decided to use this problem and find the opportunity. And as they were scattered, they said, "We're going to go everywhere and preach the word." And something about that is, in every problem that we face, there is a purpose that Satan has, and there is a purpose that our God has. Obviously, in this situation, the purpose that Satan had was he wanted to destroy the church at Jerusalem. He wanted to tear them down and take away their effectiveness. He wanted to cause them to not be able to be a church anymore. And of course, since a church is an assembly, Satan must have thought, if I can keep them from assembling, if I can cause persecution that would drive them apart, then they would no longer be effective in their mission. And he was trying to destroy the church. Did God have a purpose in this persecution? And certainly it wasn't God who caused the persecution, but God allowed it in His sovereignty. We know that God could have stopped the persecution. He could have halted the problem before it ever began. But God allowed them to face this problem. He allowed them to face this time of persecution. You say, what was God's purpose in the problem? Well, most certainly it was that they would be faithful in preaching the Word, and that as they were scattered, they would find the opportunity, which is in fact what they did, and a tremendous revival took place as a result of this church finding God's purpose, opening the door of opportunity, and getting involved in what God was doing through this situation. Now, I say all that tonight to say we're living in a very unusual time. I've had 2 funerals this week that I've conducted, and ironically, I've had 3 funerals, I think you know this, in the last week, or less than a week, and all 3 funerals have been with the same funeral director here in town, which is pretty unusual. Usually I work with different funeral directors, but this time it just happened that they were all with the same fella here in town. And we've been talking over the last several days about how weird of a time it is, how strange of a time that we're living through. And of course, from his perspective, he thinks about people grieving and all the effects on our society when people cannot reach closure, cannot grieve as they're accustomed to, and he sees the effects of that. I see it from a pastoral standpoint, and I see that as well, but I see, it's just different. I've never stood around in a funeral home with a mask on before. I've never had to say to people that, we just can only have a limited number of people at the funeral because of social distancing. It's a very unusual time. I think in our church, it's a very unusual time. We've never been through anything like this before. I hope we never go through anything like this again. But we could get so caught up in what we don't like about this situation and complaining about the restrictions and trying to be activists and that sort of a thing, that we miss what God is doing. Now, I have no doubt that in this time right now, Satan would like to destroy our church. He would like to scatter us. He would like to neutralize our testimony. He would like to drive us apart. But I also know that God has a purpose. God has something that He is up to and that He would like to accomplish. And I believe that God's purpose is, of course, what He's doing in this world. That is the proclamation of the gospel. One of the things on your prayer list tonight is to pray about the Bible studies that are going on. And it's incredible how many open doors of opportunity we have right here in the local area ministering to people with Bible studies. Pray about that. Pray that God brings some folks to salvation. Brother Castor's been working with a Spanish-speaking man here for the last number of days, and God's really at work in his life. Who knows what God will do with this time in terms of evangelism. I know that some of our missionaries on the foreign field have had tremendous opportunities using social media to get new opportunities, open doors to proclaim the gospel. So let's be praying about that. I also think that as much as Satan would like to use this time to drive us apart as a church, I think that God's purpose is, in fact, to draw us closer as a church, to help us to see more vividly the purpose of the assembly and the privilege that it is for us to be able to gather together and to worship the Lord as a church family. And so Satan has a purpose, but God has a purpose. I know that one of the things that Satan would like to do to us as a church is to drive us far from prayer and to get us so concerned about carnal and fleshly things that we have no time to spend on our face before God. But I know that God's purpose is in this time that we would be a people of prayer. And may it be said of us that we would be faithful to be spending time on our knees. We've tried to maintain these special prayer meetings in spite of the difficulty. We've tried to encourage you to spend a special time in prayer on these monthly Wednesday nights and really concentrate in prayer. And I hope tonight that you'll take that opportunity, because we know that God is doing something, and we also know that we're privileged to be a part of what God is doing. And certainly everything that God is going to do in and through us is going to involve prayer. So tonight, I hope that you'll spend some time in prayer.